Hello and welcome to this British Academy event. I'm Farhana Haider. I'm a journalist and broadcaster. I'm a presenter of the BBC World Service programme Witness History, which looks at important events in history through the eyes of the people who were there. Today's event is the 7th in a series called Why History, in which we'll be joined by British Academy Fellows and funded researchers to discuss insights from the past to help us make sense of the present. I am delighted to be joined this evening by Professor Rebecca Earle. Rebecca is Professor of History at the University of Warwick and a Fellow of the British Academy. She is a historian of food and the cultural history of Spanish America and early modern Europe. Rebecca is interested in how ordinary, everyday cultural practices, such as eating or dressing, or even using a postage stamp, shapes how we think about the world. Rebecca and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes before taking a selection of audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit this via the Q&A function. You're of course welcome to tweet during the event and can copy in at British Academy. Welcome, Rebecca, and thank you for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So the title of this event is based on your book, Feeding the People, The Politics of the Potato. I have it right here, which was published last year. It's a gripping read. For me, it was just fascinating. Who knew people and potatoes had so much in common? What struck you about the humble potato?
I learned that everyone has a potato story to tell. During the many years that I worked on this book, I found repeatedly that when I told people what I was studying, they replied with a story about their own lives. So a Norwegian woman, for example, in her 70s, who I spoke with, on hearing what I was studying, she replied, "Oh, I can feel my palms burning." And she then went on to tell me how as a child, she had peeled potatoes for her very demanding grandmother, who had insisted that her grandchildren hold the potato in the palm of their hand as they peeled it, because she didn't like the unsightly marks that were left in the potato if you impaled it on a fork. So if you held the hot potato on a fork and peeled it, it left these little marks, and her grandmother didn't like that. And now, 60 years later, she could still feel that sensation in the palm of her hand, thinking about potatoes. And so talking about potatoes is a way of telling our own stories. It leads us to talk about ourselves, our past, our memories. So it's a way of connecting to other people in some ways. That was one of the most surprising things for me that I found in working on potatoes, that the reaction was so often for people to say, "Oh, let me tell you about potatoes and me."
So from its Andean roots, how has the potato come to be seen as local? I mean, most countries claim the potato as their own.
Yeah, that's absolutely local everywhere. We think of it as completely ordinary, and the very names that we give our potatoes root them right here wherever we happen to be. So we've got King Edwards, we've got Jersey Royals, and we've got potatoes that root them right here in the British Isles. Where I grew up in the United States, people talked about Idaho potatoes. In India, you might have a Darjeeling red round potato. So potatoes have the names of the places that they're eaten, and so we think of them as really they're from right here, wherever here happens to be. But actually all these potatoes, the King Edwards and Darjeeling red rounds and Idaho potatoes and all the other potatoes in the world, all originate from one place, which is from the Americas. They originate from the long spine of mountains that runs northward from the bottom of South America, from Chile up through Peru and Bolivia, through Colombia, all the way into the Rocky Mountains. And that's the homeland of potatoes. That's as botanists call it, the cradle area. A lovely term, I think, of potatoes. So that's the cradle that they were rocked and nurtured in, perhaps by the potato goddess Ashamama, who was a deity of the Incas. So potatoes were absolutely ordinary and important staple for mountain peoples all along this ridge of mountains. They were an ordinary everyday food, but nobody else in the world had ever laid eyes on them before Europeans invaded the Americas, starting with Columbus in 1492. And then eventually bands of conquistadors made their way into South America and down into the Inca Empire, into the heartland of potatoes, and ultimately overthrew this powerful empire, established a colonial presence which lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years, and in the process released a sort of whirlwind that blew potatoes all over the world. So there's a story that you can tell about how potatoes got to be here, which is part of a history of colonialism. It's a history of imperial travel. It's a history of early modern trade. But it's also a history of the local places where potatoes landed up. So the ways in which potatoes became embedded in local ways of eating and in local cuisines all around the world is always a dynamic story of the processes that brought the potato there and the local circumstances that they encountered in all the different places they ended up.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we touched on
go on, but I'll stop at that.
No, I mean, it's all so fascinating, but just to discuss a bit more on something that you touched on there. I mean, how can the potato help us understand modern history, Rebecca?
Well, thinking about the history of the potato, in fact, provides a way of thinking about some of the very large historical processes that have shaped the modern world, such as colonialism or nationalism or industrialization. And that's because the potato turns out to be embedded in these very large processes. So, I mean, the little example that I just gave of how the colonization of Latin America was a necessary process to lead to the potato being in the British Isles helps give a sense of how our ordinary potato is a product of colonialism in some ways, you could say. So the potato is embedded in all sorts of ways in these big processes. And one of the things I was trying to look at in the book was the way in which the potato was, in fact, part of a history of nationalism or industrialization or a whole series of other important processes. It's not always self-evident. But once we start thinking about potatoes, about this quintessentially ordinary, everyday food, and then say their connections to colonialism, we can see how these big processes, these isms, didn't just happen, out there. They didn't just happen somewhere else. They happened where we are, as well as somewhere far away. And it helps, I think, it helps us connect our ordinary, everyday lives and the ordinary, everyday lives of ordinary people in the past. It helps connect our ordinary lives to history. It helps show how our lives are shaped by history in very tangible ways, and that we're part of history. We're not just on the margins watching history, which is a big play that important people are doing. We're part of it. And eating, I think, is one way of seeing that very clearly.
I mean, are there any dominant historical narratives that you've found the potato can help us understand or to question or reconsider?
I think one really important idea that people might have about history, that historians also sometimes replicate to some extent, I mean, inadvertently very often, is about who makes history. This question that I was just raising a moment ago, it's about who are the historical actors whose agency is important. And so one of the things I think the potato can also help us see is the agency of ordinary people. And part of the reason I end up writing this book, I've been interested in the history of food, and particularly food from Latin America for a long time. But why the potato? People ask me this a lot. Say, why are you writing about potatoes? What's so interesting about potatoes? I can tell you my story about me and the potato, but why is it interesting to history? People would say that to me a lot. And part of the reason is because there was something about the standard narrative about the spread of the potatoes around the world that really got up my nose. It just didn't sit right with me. And the standard story goes something like this. So it's something along these lines. So if you ask the question, how did potatoes come to Europe? How did Europeans become such assiduous eaters of potatoes, given that the potato is from South America, it's not local, etc. So the standard story went more or less like this. So potatoes reached Europe in the 1500s, and they were interesting to botanists, and they briefly had a sort of vogue as a novelty item for members of the elite, but ordinary people wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. They were peculiar. They weren't mentioned in the Bible, and we all know that ordinary people in early modern Europe wouldn't eat anything that wasn't mentioned in the Bible. They grew in a peculiar way. They didn't grow from seeds. They grew from tubers, and nobody knew how to deal with that. And they were knobbly and lumpy, and they probably gave you leprosy, and they, were just wrong in every way. They had sort of, peculiar look, a peculiar shape. They were in the same family as deadly nightshade and henbane, which everybody knew was poisonous. So why would people eat potatoes? So there's a kind of standard litany of things that people must have thought were wrong with potatoes in 1500 or in 1600 that often get wheeled out to explain a supposed fact, which is that ordinary people didn't want to eat potatoes until in the 18th century, far-sighted aristocrats like Frederick the Great of Prussia or Catherine the Great of Russia, or someone called Parmentier in Paris, until these far-sighted individuals in the 18th century started encouraging people to eat potatoes because they recognized that they were a super good food. And then little by little, these conservative peasants and ordinary people were won over to the multiple charms of the potato, and now we all eat potatoes. So that was kind of the story. I thought that just does not fit in any way anything that history tells us about peasants, for example. Peasants are not generally super conservative people who will not do anything that's not mentioned in the Bible. They are people who will innovate constantly in an attempt to keep body and soul together. They'll experiment, they'll exchange crops and seeds with their neighbors, they'll talk, they'll experiment on whether they can make a slightly bigger harvest. And there's a lot of scholarship that shows this. So first of all, it didn't seem likely that peasants would just be sitting there saying, well, my grandfather never ate that, I'm not having it. And particularly if you also looked into the details of some of the particular things that supposedly the potato had wrong with it, none of them make sense either. And most of the things that people ate in the 1500s or the 1600s in Europe aren't mentioned in the Bible. I mean, I'm not sure the cabbage is mentioned in the Bible, but people were happily eating that. Other things in the same family as deadly nightshade, also from the Americas, other new plants in the same Solanaceum family as potatoes, which were recognized as being in the same family as deadly nightshade, etc. at the same time, quickly became super popular. Chili peppers became super popular in early modern Europe. By 1590, one Spaniard commented, he said, oh, they're an ordinary thing. Everyone knows what they are. I don't need to describe them in my account of things from Latin America. We all know what a chili pepper is. So it didn't make sense to me that people would say chili peppers from the same family as deadly nightshade, and we like them. Potatoes from the same family as deadly nightshade, mustn't touch them. So all of that seemed to be wrong. Anyway, this is a very long way of saying that I got quite obsessively interested in finding evidence that ordinary people in the 1500s and 1600s in Europe were eating potatoes. And it turns out, as far as I can tell, they were the first people to be eating potatoes on a significant scale. They were the ones who figured out how to grow this South American tuber in Europe's varied climates. They were the ones who figured out how to adapt the potato to different day lengths. They were the innovators who have taught the world, in a way, the rest of the world, how to eat potatoes. So it seemed to me there was sort of a historical injustice at play if we were writing off the agency of these nameless small farmers, often women as well, who were doing the hard work of making the potato into a European crop. So this is a very long answer to your very simple question of what dominant narratives might the potato help us question. And one is that this question about who makes history. Is it far-sighted elites? Or is it actually sometimes people whose names we don't even know? So I think that would be one thing that I would encourage people to think about who it is who has shaped the past and who shapes our present now. It's not necessarily the powerful people whose names we might have studied as school children, but actually other people altogether.
Fascinating. I mean, having read your book, I'm very glad that you got obsessed with potatoes. Discussing your book and how potatoes fit into the modern history provides us with a platform to discuss some wider themes about the relationship between food, power, and ideas about eating. There's so many questions that come out of that. For example, when did the state become interested in what we eat? And something that relates very much to now, is there a prehistory to eating guidelines and government recommendations in eating healthily?
Yes, well, there certainly is. So I was mentioning a moment ago this bad story, you know, the sort of, as I would say, the rogue story about how Europeans learned to eat potatoes. And I mentioned some 18th century individuals like Frederick the Great of Prussia, who were credited with spreading the potato's popularity in the 18th century. And although, as I was rambling on about a moment ago, I think that the spread of potatoes didn't really have anything much to do with these 18th century potato promoters. It is the case that in the 18th century, potatoes experienced an absolute vogue in Europe and became extremely popular with far-sighted aristocrats and governments and scientists and all sorts of members of the Republic of Letters during the Enlightenment became really interested in potatoes. There was a wonderful comment from a French journal from the mid-18th century where the journalist was writing, for several years, people have talked of nothing but potatoes. And a bit of an exaggeration, but an indication that the potato had entered the public sphere, let's say. So why was that? Because over the course of the 18th century, ideas about how to govern well changed quite substantially. So that during the 18th century, theories of governance and ideas about how to manage a state effectively began to accord more and more importance to the population as a concept. So the people who inhabited the territory of a ruler began increasingly over the 18th century to be conceptualized as a sort of entity, the population, not just a random bunch of people inhabiting the territory of a prince, but as a resource that helped make the state powerful if it was properly used. So over the course of the 18th century, there was ever more emphasis on what a government should do to make effective use of this resource, the population. There's lots of writing about this. So this is all, and the general principle was that the larger and more active and the more productive a state's population was, the stronger that state would be. So this is pre-Malthus, right? This is before the idea that a population could be too big was really significant. So there was a general sense that you needed a large, healthy, robust, hardworking population, and that would make your state more powerful than, say, France or the neighboring states. So there was a great deal of emphasis, and this was quite new. This was really not something that had been the case some hundreds of years earlier, on thinking about the robustness of the population, its fitness to provide sailors and soldiers and agricultural workers. That became a topic of a lot of discussion. And all of this led quite naturally to a quite not new focus on what ordinary people were eating. Because what they ate was important to how powerful the state was. So unlike in previous centuries when rulers had been, they worried about famine because people might starve and then they might riot and then there might be, social disorder. But they didn't particularly care if people were eating, if they were baking their bread or they were griddling farls on a griddle. That didn't really matter, right? People didn't care what they were eating from the point of view of the heartiness of the diet. I could go on more about that, but I won't. The general sense was, as long as people had the right, had food, that was what mattered. In the 18th century, then the heartiness of the population became really important. And so people started putting more and more effort into thinking about what sorts of foods would build up a really hearty population. Generally speaking, an option that was not considered was totally transforming the social structure in a way that would give ordinary people more money so that they could afford better food. That wasn't the general focus. The focus was more on finding cheaper foods that would be more nourishing. And that was where the potato fit in. So potatoes, that was why potatoes became so interesting to 18th century philosophers and politicians. It was a way of building up a strong, hearty population with a low cost, easy to grow food, which even had the added advantage that since it wasn't a grain, if you got the population off wheat bread and onto potatoes, but you carried on using this now hearty, well-nourished population to grow lots of wheat, you could even export that wheat to some other less progressive country that hadn't figured out how to do this. And then you could have a positive balance of trade. People would be healthy and happy. Everything would be good, right? So the origins of the idea that what we eat matters to the state lie in the 18th century.
Fascinating. So it was lauded, the potato was lauded during the Enlightenment, but why then during the 19th century was it seen as an obstacle to modernity?
So the changing status of the potato as a foodstuff mirrors the changing nature of the state. So before the 18th century, before this sort of new idea about population as being one of the keys to power and grandeur and opulence, before that, in, let's say, the mid-16th century, when the potato was already present in Europe, or the early 17th century, when the potato, for example, was becoming quite widely eaten in Ireland, in the before period, when states didn't really care what people ate, no political theorist cared about potatoes, but insofar as they thought about potatoes at all, they thought, this is a troublesome food because it's very easy to grow and it encourages people to laze around and not do very much work because it's such a great crop that the Irish, for example, people complained, could get by on not enough work. They could do a couple of days' work growing potatoes, and then the potato was so healthy that they didn't have to do any work, and then that was just bad because they just lay around and smoke tobacco and were irresponsible. So the sort of idea that the population was important as a resource hadn't really, wasn't present in the 16th century. And so the potato status kind of mirrors that. If anything, it just encourages people to be feckless. In the 18th century, when the population started to become really important, the potato became really important as this way to build this healthy, robust, energetic population. In the 19th century, that same concern with the population was there. The same, we still have it, this idea that a healthy population somehow, helps make a powerful state, that everybody in the nation should be, if we're all terribly ill, we're all obese because we don't exercise enough, that's bad for Britain in some way. We still have that idea. In the 19th century, that idea was very powerful, but the nature of the economy was changing. And so the kind of population that you needed was changing during the 19th century. And that nations such as Britain or Germany were industrializing, and politicians and scientists and others continued to be really concerned about the ability of the population to provide the necessary labor. But what sort of labor was needed was changing. So instead of stolid, hearty agricultural workers, what the state needed increasingly, what the economy needed, was conceptualized as being sort of part of a machine, a finely tuned industrial worker who could operate machinery in an efficient way. Kind of if you have an image of Charlie Chaplin in modern times, kind of, operating this machine, and his body is kind of part of the industrial process. That was increasingly the way people talked about labor. as a human motor. The human worker was a motor who needed to be powered with the right kind of food. And sadly, from the potato's point of view, nutrition over the course of the 19th century took an ever dimmer view of the potato's qualities as a source of nutrients. So nutritive science, or nutritional science, evolved over the 19th century, and the general consensus was that the potato was a lousy food. And so writers and nutritionists talked about the one of the great expressions I encountered was the lazy potato blood that builds up in people who eat too many potatoes, and that just made you kind of lumpen and sluggish. And if anything, it turned you into a peasant, not to this, highly tuned industrial worker. So there was a huge anti-potato rhetoric that emerged in the 19th century of why potatoes were bad and why this country's economic output lagged behind that country's economic output, was correlated to how much potato the relevant countries ate. So whereas in the 18th century, more potatoes equaled more energetic workers, by the 19th century, more potatoes was seen as indicating lower quality workers who would drag, a kind of weight, a lump on the economy. It's not by chance that when Karl Marx wanted to talk about peasants in France in one of his famous writings in the mid 19th century, and he wanted to talk about how French peasants were unable to participate in the modern state. They were sat on the margins of modernity, and they were just sort of these isolated individuals who couldn't act together, who couldn't participate meaningfully in politics. The metaphor he chose was a sack of potatoes. It's not by chance. So potatoes were associated with backward peasants, not with productive labor. So we can see again, there's this, the status of the potato mirrors the changing nature of the state over this period. So I guess that gives a sort of answer to why the potato was a roadblock on the road to modernity.
Fascinating. I mean, going back to something we touched on earlier, Rebecca, colonialism. How did the spread of new foods from the Americas, such as the potato, connect to the history of colonialism? Do our diets today reflect that history?
Yeah, they absolutely do. I mean, foods traveled because people traveled. So sugar, tea, other things that what people called colonial groceries, their presence in Europe is, for example, absolutely a consequence of colonialism. I mean, I think many people can recognize how the cup of sweet tea that powered the Industrial Revolution in Britain, that fueled the labor that was actually taking place in those factories and cotton mills, etc., from the late 18th century onward, that cup of sweet tea was itself, of course, a product of colonialism, with the tea coming increasingly from British colony in India, the sugar produced with enslaved labor in the West Indies. So it's absolutely, food is absolutely part of this larger history of colonialism. And one of the things that scholars have shown really nicely is, again, that food is a way in which colonialism really came home to Britain. So colonialism wasn't something, again, that happened out there. Colonialism wasn't something that happened in the West Indies or in India or something like that. It was happening all over Britain. And so scholars have shown that, for example, these colonial groceries like tea and sugar were available up and down the British Isles in the 18th century. I mean, small towns in Yorkshire were selling these colonial products. You could buy your tea, you could buy your sugar all over the place. So the empire was right here in the form of food, among other things. I mean, it wasn't just here in the form of food. But so I think we can connect foods to that history of colonialism very powerfully. I mean, at the same time that these groceries were pouring into colonial metropole, industrialized processed foods from Europe, for example, were also traveling around the world and were embedding themselves into colonial spaces at the same time. So eating habits in colonial spaces were being transformed by colonialism in all sorts of ways. at the same time. So it wasn't, it was, a global change that was happening. I mean, so I think, food is a really good example. It sort of mirrors this comment that people, this, I think, excellent aphorism that people have often cited to explain the presence of people from other part of the world is, we're here because you were there. The same thing can be said about food, that these foods are here because we were there. Foods traveled because people traveled. And those two histories can't be separated out.
So can we use food to tell a story about immigration and its impact on society then, Rebecca?
Well, I think you could certainly do that. I mean, there was a famous example of using food as a way of talking about immigration in Britain from Robin Cook, for example. So, I mean, more than 20 years ago, he gave what's now famous among food scholars as the chicken tikka masala speech, in which let me get this. I wrote it down. So let me just see if I can quote this right. Where did I put this? He made a comment about how chicken tikka masala was a. Do I have this? Did I write this down? I hope I did, because it was such a. I'll try to. I wanted to quote it.
Okay.
Here we are. Yes, I found it. Here we are. He said, chicken tikka masala is now a true British national dish, not only because it is the most popular, but because it is a perfect illustration of the way Britain absorbs and adapts external influences. So he was very explicitly trying to use the popularity of a sort of hybrid dish, a blended dish, as a metaphor and a symbol for a multicultural Britain. So, and there are lots of ways that we can try to tell stories about immigration. I mean, my background is in Latin American history before I became interested in the history of food. And there are lots of examples from Latin America of dishes, particular dishes that are held up as being emblematic of the nation because they're emblematic of the mixtures of people who came to that nation. So, I mean, for example, when I was in Peru, people explained to me that ceviche, a common Peruvian dish or a popular Peruvian dish with sort of seafood that gets cooked in citrus, in lemon juice or lime juice, and that's often served with slices of sweet potato and also popcorn. In Peru, it's often eaten with popcorn on the side. And so various people told me, well, this is an emblem of Peru because the shellfish represents the indigenous population. It's local, it's right from here. The citrus that it's cooked in represents Spanish colonialism because citrus fruit came over with the Spaniards. And the sweet potato, various people said, represents the Afro-Peruvian population because sweet potatoes are widely eaten by Afro-Peruvians. And so, the sort of dish was being held up as an emblem of multicultural Peru. So it's something that it's a powerful image. And I mean, it works in many ways because food is actually one of the places where we really experience national identity. It's a place where we really sort of feel the nation, or we feel the otherness of other places. It's often not in, it's not always in the sort of, speeches or rallies or explicitly national events that we feel a national identity. It's often in these very quotidian activities like eating. So it makes a lot of sense to think about food as a way of telling a story about the country and about different peoples and different ways of eating that came together and that make up a composite nation. In fact, there are lots of people who study cookbooks have made some very interesting comments about how cookery books can help perform the sort of magic that lies at the heart of nationalism. Because at the heart of nationalism is this sense of a connectedness to a huge mass of people, most of whom you'll never meet in your life, right? That you have something in common with all of these people who inhabit some space, but you don't really have you don't know them. So how do you get in your head that idea that you're all connected? And food is a really good way of doing it, partly because there's a way of we understand the story of building up an idea of a national cuisine out of regions. So lots of cookery books, if you get a cookery book of Italian food, for example, it might be divided into regions. It wouldn't surprise you to have a cookbook that said, okay, these are the foods that are typical of Northern Italy, and now here are the foods that are typical of Southern Italy. And look at all together, that makes Italian food. And those foods might be quite different, right? In fact, their difference might be part of what's really interesting. But we sort of accept that all together, these different foods sum up to a thing which we accept as Italian food. And that then kind of acts as a model for our thinking about Italy. So food is a way that you can meld together difference into a united whole. And then, work that nationalist magic, that, sprinkle that magic of nationalism on top of it. So then we then feel, yeah, of course there's a thing which is Italy. So I think it's a way of telling that story. And it's a way you can tell I'll shut up in a minute. It's a way you can tell a very positive story as well, because you can talk about all these great foods which have come into the country and which have then transformed the way we eat in a way which is something that, people that you celebrate, particularly in cookery books.
Fascinating. I didn't know about the chicken tikka masala speech. I'll go back and have a listen to it, actually. We will be going to questions very soon. They are coming in, so thank you very much for that. But before we do, a couple of more questions, Rebecca. What insights can history tell us about food eating during a pandemic and public health crisis? Obviously, particularly relevant now.
Well, there is a long, long history of people thinking about the connections between food and health. And there's a long history of particular foods being connected either to eating yourself well, in a sense, or to being a cause of illness. So, for example, there was in an epidemic that afflicted Barcelona in the late 1500s, there's a nice diary by somebody who was keeping a diary during this pandemic. And he said, during this epidemic in Barcelona. And he said, lots of people are saying that this epidemic of disease has been caused by people eating bad food. And he mentions carrots, and I think he mentions potatoes as well as a possible, foods that somehow aren't good for you and that might have encouraged the spread of disease. So there's a history of picking on particular foods and saying, this food is dangerous. In the 19th century, meat was considered really worrisome because you might get tuberculosis from it. There was a lot of anxiety about, and then, it was contagious. Tuberculosis was contagious, and maybe you could get tuberculosis from eating a cow that had died of bovine tuberculosis, and then you would spread this to other people. So there's, also there's a long history of worrying about particular foodstuffs. Sometimes not unreasonably, as being threats to public health. But there's also a parallel history of foods that, maybe you can eat yourself well from. Foods that if you consume these things, it'll help you get better. It'll cure what ails you. Even if, not just physical ailments, but also emotional ailments. There was interesting suggestions from past centuries that things like nostalgia could be addressed by eating the right foods, for example. So food has been part of our understanding of health and well-being from as long as people have existed, I think.
Yeah, interesting. We're going to go to questions just now, but before we do, what are you working on next, Rebecca? Where's your research going to take you next?
I think into recipes. I think I'm very interested in the way in which we can tell family histories through those recipe collections that many of us have cookery books we've inherited usually from female relatives, from, mothers and grandmothers, or collections of, books that might have things that have been scissored out of newspapers, shoved between the pages, etc. These are archives of our own family's lives. And so I'm interested in the way in which we can use these documents to try to explore other small histories of often the female relatives in our lives who perhaps didn't leave a huge amount of writing, but might have left us a stained cookery book, or a copy of Delia Smith creased open on particular pages.
Rebecca, thank you so much. So we'll go to questions now. And we've already had a few questions about the Irish famine. So this question might be apt. Would you explore the social, political and economic role of the potato in the context of the Irish potato famine?
Well, so the potato in Ireland illustrates very well the connections between colonialism and the spread of potatoes in particular, and foodstuffs in general. So Ireland, as we know, was colonized by the British in the early modern period. And the spread of the potato coincided with that process and with the loss of land that Irish small farmers experienced during this period of colonization, and which was English colonization, I should say, was associated also with the increasing spread of commercial agriculture, the rise of the dairy industry, the increasing export of preserved meats to actually to the Caribbean, among other places, to feed enslaved workers, and butter and other dairy products to England. So there was a rise of, I'll get onto the potato famine quickly. There was a growing commercial agriculture, loss of land from Irish small farmers and peasants, and an increasing reliance on the potato, because the potato is a super good food. It's incredibly prolific. If you have a small patch of land and you want to get the most calories out of it, you would be hard pressed to come up with a crop better than potatoes. It's such an excellent source of converting soil and sunlight into calories. And it made it possible for Irish families to survive on smaller and smaller plots of land, particularly if they were lucky enough to have a milk cow, because the potato combined with a small amount of dairy is really a very nourishing foodstuff. So it made it possible for a situation that in some ways perhaps shouldn't have been tenable, shrinking land patches and growing population, to be tenable. So the potato was crucial to keeping the system going. The other thing that was happening over the course of the 19th century was that the varieties of potatoes that were being grown in Ireland were shrinking, so that many of the potatoes that were being grown by the 1840s was a single variety called Irish lumper, which I've never tasted. I spent some time trying to get hold of seed potatoes for Irish lumper to see what it was like. No success. I'd be interested if anyone there has tried it. But as we all know, if you have a monoculture, it greatly increases the vulnerability to a pathogen, so that when this late blight, this particular pathogen, spread across Ireland, there was very little resistance in the potato fields. I should say that the blight afflicted mainland Europe as well. Ireland was not the only country affected by this 1840s terrible blight. It produced tens of thousands of deaths in the Low Countries, for example, in various parts of mainland Europe. But the difference in death toll in Ireland, more than 1 million people died. And the difference has to do not with the devastatingness of the blight, but with the way in which the potato had become such a crucial sustainer of an unsustainable situation. So Irish laborers were eating, 5 kilos of potatoes a day and not very much else by the 1840s. So when the crop failed, and then it failed repeatedly, it wasn't just a single year of famine, it happened over and over again. The results were devastating in a way that was not the case in Belgium, even though they had a bad famine, because the potato hadn't become the sole single staple. There's a lot to be said about Britain's involvement in this. Britain, from the perspective of London, from the point of view of officials in the British Treasury, there was a lot good to be said about the famine, in that it wiped out a system that they didn't like, which was these freestanding, independent, small cottiers, and replaced it with a kind of rural proletariat, which was seen as being a step forward. But that's a whole other topic. I will shut up so we can get to some other questions.
Fascinating, fascinating. So we've got another question here from Lucinda, who asks, could you talk a little more about using food as a remedy for nostalgia? I'm particularly interested in food and exile in early modern Italy. Great question, though.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, your emotion I should say, when I say early modern, I mean, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, probably, just to not use too much jargon. Mm-hmm. So in this period, your emotions were considered in some ways almost an external physical force. So all sorts of things affected your health. How much exercise you took, what sorts of foods you ate, how effectively your digestive system operated, and how well you excreted, how much sleep you had. All of these things were seen as affecting your physical health. I mean, much as we do today, we might say how much sleep you get, how much exercise you take, what sort of diet you consume. All of that affects your health. They thought that too. They also thought that your emotional state affected your health, and that was sort of almost an external thing that would come upon you. But the same way that all of these things, what you ate, how much you slept, your state of mind, affected your constitution and your health, so they could also help correct imbalances. So if you were ill from eating the wrong things, if you adjusted your sleep pattern and your diet, maybe that would level things out. And so nostalgia, which was seen as being a powerful emotional state of mind, could partially be corrected by eating the right foods that would help balance out your body. So if you were thrown out of kilter in an emotional way, you could kind of rebalance through adjustments in your diet. This was really concerned, and nostalgia was really important to people in the early modern period, because this was a period when Europeans were traveling abroad much more than they ever had. And so they worried about what would happen if you got if you were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, mm-hmm. and you felt homesick. This was a not improbable scenario for health manuals to address. And it's addressed in travelers' handbooks. So.
Fascinating. Great question as well. Thank you for that. Jeff is asking, you seem to imply that the food we eat is determined to a large extent by the rulers. Isn't there a danger of our diet being determined by what is easiest to grow rather than what is healthy to grow?
Well, I think that is a big concern. I certainly don't mean to imply that our diets are determined by elites and rulers. Not at all. And so, I mean, for example, the spread of the potato in early modern Europe wasn't something that was directed by rulers and elites. It was something that ordinary people did for themselves because they saw benefits in the potato. In the 18th century, the state started getting interested in what people were eating, but that doesn't mean they were necessarily successful in exercising control. I would say it was really only in the 20th century that states started to possess the mechanisms that would allow them to shape the population's diet in any meaningful way. So in the 20th century, we start to see the emergence of school meals, for example, in many European countries, and not just in Europe. We start to see increasing emphasis on creating, and during times of war, on national canteens or workers' canteens to try to provide food for key workers. So this is really, I think, a 20th century phenomenon, that the state had that technical ability to try to influence people's diets. But I absolutely agree that the danger is focusing on what's easy to grow rather than what's healthful. And I think that's the world that we're in now. And so it's not just what's easy to grow, but also what's profitable to grow, and not just what's healthful to us, but what's environmentally sustainable.
Absolutely.
So I think there's an enormous tension there. And I think that's you're absolutely right. I didn't say anything at all about that, but I think you're quite right to bring that up as a real danger. So I don't think it's so much actually now that it's necessarily states dictating to us. It's actually the way in which the industrial food system dictates, and that states are very tentative when they try to make interventions to try to balance out what's healthful as opposed to what's cheap, for example. There was well, I'll shut up with that, but we're familiar with it. All I need to say is sugar tax, I guess.
Sugar tax, yes, absolutely. But yeah, the environment and food is so intertwined now more than ever. Kate is thanking you for a great talk, Rebecca, so that's great. She asked, how far is potato planting associated with missionary activity around the world? Another great question.
Oh, thank you for asking that. It really was. So, I mean, as I've said, the potato comes from Latin America, and it came to Europe from Latin America. By the 19th century, Europeans thought of the potato as completely European. They had sort of appropriated it as something that was European and disseminated it in various colonial spaces across Africa, across Asia. It was part of a package of Europeanness that colonial officials and missionaries tried to inculcate in colonial spaces. And so there's lots of discussion of, for example, missionaries saying, oh, well, in this place, they don't know how to grow potatoes whatsoever. They're completely backward, but only in the gardens of people who've accepted Christianity. They have neat and tidy gardens, and they grow potatoes really properly, and they plant them, the right way, and they're generally more civilized altogether. So there's a really striking correlation between positive commentary on potato cultivation and can I say self-congratulatory comments about the success of the colonial mission. So, I mean, what's remarkable about this is that in this process, the South American potato ended up being held up as an emblem of European superiority. Mm-hmm. So it absolutely is. And so growing potatoes was one of the things that missionaries wanted converts to be doing. And they wanted them to be doing it in the right way, using the horticultural techniques that were recommended, not planting them in, too shallow ground, or, there's a whole litany of things that people do wrong growing potatoes. But when they do it properly under the instruction of missionaries, it's a sign of civilization.
Great. We're having so many questions coming in. Maybe we can help someone with family folklore. Greta asked, is it true that potato blossoms were appreciated as exquisite flowers in the 18th century? My mum told me this as a particular story in my childhood. Is it true?
Well, yes, I think so. There is a story, particularly about, I think it's Marie Antoinette, wearing potato flowers in her hair as an attempt to encourage potato consumption as part of this 18th century vogue, when the states started thinking potatoes are super great. Everybody should eat more potatoes. They should eat less wheat. They should stop eating bread altogether. Potatoes are just wonderful. And there were all these promotional schemes and attempts to encourage people to eat potatoes and to grow more potatoes and win prizes for I just tipped over my laptop, for the biggest potato harvest, etc. And so I haven't verified this story from my own. I haven't found 18th century sources for it, but I've certainly read about it, and I see no reason to think it wouldn't be true, because it's completely consistent with this general promotional drive for encouraging people to eat more potatoes, and with the idea, which underpins this, that ordinary people imitate the practices of the elites. This was often the idea, and so if elites did it, ordinary people would naturally imitate. That was the hope of the 18th century.
There you go.
Your mother may well be right.
Yes, there you go, Greta. Your mother was right. Again, touching on the history of the potato and its migration. If potatoes originated in South America, why are maize and corn more widespread sources of starch there? It's an interesting one.
More widespread sources of starch in Latin America.
Exactly, in Latin America.
That's a really good question as well. Mm-hmm. So the potato, I shouldn't say that the potato was uniquely confined to the South American Andes, because researchers have found evidence of potatoes in Utah, in the United States. So there were wild potatoes all the way up in the very northern tip of the Rocky Mountain, the Rockies, and the same mountain chain. So there were potatoes all the way along, but there weren't potatoes outside. I mean, leaving aside Utah in 12,000 years ago. potatoes mostly were confined to the Andean region, and they, whereas maize was much more widely disseminated. So, I mean, there was a much greater presence of maize in the Americas, and sweet potatoes as well are widely present all along the, I mean, in the Caribbean, all along the, both the Pacific and the Atlantic coasts. So, I mean, it's a really good question. Why did the potato not spread more widely? Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess I don't have a pat answer for that, which has to do with partly with natural barriers. I mean, so the Inca Empire, for example, and the Aztec Empire in central Mexico were not in contact with each other. So there wasn't trade. I guess that's the best answer, is to say that there weren't movements of people trading very widely in a way that would have spread these foodstuffs around as much as they might have. Because as I guess I was saying before, foods mostly travel when people travel. You know, the occasional coconut floats across an ocean, but mostly it takes people. Well, even though mostly, often it takes people to move food. So I think that would be part of the reason.
Great
That's
question.
a really good question.
Yeah.
Think about that more.
Someone moving on to your research that you're going to do next. Given your plans to look at recipes, Rebecca, how do you assess the use of potatoes in the years of World War II rationing? And should we be using them to replace meat now?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. We should all be eating less meat. I think that's the advice. And potatoes were really important in the Second World War for all contending powers. So, I mean, Lizzie Cullingham, another historian of food, has written a truly wonderful book called The Taste of War, in which she talks a lot about the role of potatoes in every country that was at war practically. And she says at one point, potatoes were the taste of World War II for everyone. I think that's an interesting phrase. There's, I won't, in the interest of time, I won't tell you about Nazi potato laws, but I'll just say the Nazis had rules about potatoes. But so potatoes they were so important in Britain that they were so successfully encouraged that the potato crop actually outstripped consumption. And so the British government had to come up with ways of trying to encourage people to eat more potatoes, because they were so successful in encouraging people to grow them that consumption kind of ran behind to catch up. And many of those recipes are really interesting and worth looking at. But in general, potatoes, we should all be eating more potatoes. I think during World War II, people were being told they should eat the equivalent of about 2 large potatoes every day. That was the government advice. That might be pushing it a bit, but
2 large potatoes every day.
That was the recommendation.
Rebecca, I think we're running out of time. We'll all be Googling Nazi potato law after the event, I think. I am fascinated to find out more about that. But sadly, our time is up. I want to thank you very much for joining us this evening and for taking part in what has been an absolutely fascinating hour. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for letting me talk about potatoes.
I'd also like to thank our audience for some great questions. Do make sure you join us for the next event in the Why History series. And that's on Tuesday, the 18th of May, with the British Academy Fellow, Professor Chris Gosden, on the history of magic. Details are available on the British Academy website. Thanks again to Rebecca, and thank you very much for joining us.